So as I mentioned, my name is Liz Herman, and I am a trainer and programs analyst with EarthSoft. And today we're going to be talking about part 4 in our 4-part EnviroInsite Office Hour series. And we're going to discuss how to create strip logs. So if you've been with us for the rest of the series, you'll know that we've already talked about creating cross sections, base maps and layouts, and then geochemistry plots in the last 3 sessions. So today we're going to focus on strip logs. So the agenda for today's session is going to include a basic review of what a strip log is, some of the tables that will need to be populated for the various strip log data to be available, and how to create a strip log. So for this demo specifically today, I am using EQuIS Professional version 6.6 with the Springfield dataset, EnviroInsite version 10.0.0.65, a .NET framework of 4.6.2, and all of my software is 64-bit. Which is definitely important when you're trying to plot information in EnviroInsite to make sure all of your bitnesses match. So a strip log will essentially take all kinds of information and put it into a nice chart where it's all scaled and there for you right in front of you. And it includes information like geologic, well construction, and geophysical data in that chart. So in order to make that data available to you from EQuIS, you need to make sure that that is in the associated EQuIS tables. And those include DT location, DT result, and lithology. And then the 3 big ones in terms of the strip log plotting are DT downhole point, DT well segment, and DT water table. I'll show you what some of that information looks like here in a little bit when we actually get into the demo. So here's an example strip log on screen. And what we're going to talk about today, excuse me, what we're going to talk about today is how to plot these individual types of data on your strip logs. You can add stratigraphy, boring log data. You can add the axis so that you have a bit of information about the depth. We will look at how to add observation data, but it's not here on this example on screen. You can add well screen information, depth to water, and then you can also plot geophysics and also downhole data. So there's lots of different kinds of information you can include in the strip log, and really the only barrier for including that is whether or not it's present in the associated EQuIS tables. So for our demonstration today, I'm going to go through briefly how to connect EnviroInsite to our EQuIS database. And then I'm going to select the strip log section on our panel, and then pick the locations that I want to plot, and then sort of go through the process of picking each of the individual types of strip log data that I want to include. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing my camera now, and so that we can focus on, excuse me, focus on the data itself. So I have on my screen here, I've opened up EnviroInsite, and I've actually already connected to my EQuIS database, but I'll go through that process again, just so that we get it as a brief review. So I will click on the File menu and select Open Database and EQuIS Database. And my login information opened up on my other screen. But I'm going to connect to my target database and select my Springfield data, because that's where my data resides that I'm going to be using today. And then I get a quick notice of how I would like to have my EQuIS data set up. I'm going to leave it as default for right now, but we will come back to this screen later so that we can set some additional parameters that might be variable depending on what your data sets actually look like. So I'll say OK. And in order to plot a strip log, all you have to do is come over here to the right-hand panel and then click on the strip logs button under the tasks pane. And that will open up our strip logs window. I've got to give it a second here while there we go. So here's our strip log window, and this is where we're going to be doing all of our configuration of adding the various data. So by default, it will select boring and axis. I would say for almost every situation, you definitely want to include the axis because that's going to give you your depth information, you know, sort of off there on the side, like we saw in the screenshot earlier. But we can also add some additional information like stratigraphy, any observation like particular analyte concentration at a given well, well screen, our depth to water, and then geophysics and downhole point data. But for first, we're just going to add the boring and axis information. So I need to pick my target locations. So I'll click my list button. And then I'm going to scroll down to my soil borings and select a handful of those guys, probably through 14 or so. And once I've selected that with a Shift-click, I'm going to click the arrow that points to my right to add them to the selected section. and then say OK. So nothing looks like it's updated on this screen, but it has selected those particular locations now, and those will happily plot for me. It's set up to tile the individual charts for all of those soil borings that I picked sort of across the screen. And by default, it selects or suggests 4 across. I'm going to change that to 6 and see how that presents. And then I'll say OK. And then we wait for a moment while EnviroInsite draws that data. And you can see that we've got all of these guys plotted across, 6 across. And since I happen to have 13, we've got this one straggler down here. And if I wanted to zoom in on these individually, I can use my scroll wheel, or if you have a trackball mouse like I do, you can use the option to just zoom in using the click zoom there. That's this guy right up here, that user specified window zoom. Okay, so now we can see the specifics for our boring data and our axis. So that's the boring data is going to be listed here on the right, and then our axis information is on the left. And you can see that you see some of the variation across each of these locations. Okay, so that's pretty handy, pretty easy to add that information. If you're not wild about the particular colors and things like that that have been added here, you can actually change that if you want. And you can do that under the Edit menu and Format and select Geology. And that will allow you under here to change not only the color, but also any sort of particular cross-hatching and that kind of thing that you want to add. I'm happy with what I've got going on here now, so I'll go ahead and leave those as is. But so maybe I want to go ahead and add some additional information. If I want to do it sort of on the fly, I can do it from this page log section down here. You'll note that we've got the option to add stratigraphic data, some screen, or geophysical. If I click Plot Stratigraphy and then click the Apply button down here, it'll redraw briefly, and then I get all of my stratigraphic data. So you can see we've got our Aquifer 1 and Aquifer 2 data listed right there. Now, if I want to change this information, same as I did before with the boring data, I can come back up into my Edit menu and down to Format, and this time I would select Stratigraphy. And so if I wanted to change my stratigraphy for my first aquifer to this hatch style, and maybe change my lines to a dark blue, perhaps, I can do that and say, OK. And then it'll redraw this. And now you can see that I've got that hatch redrawn. Now, if I'm not happy with the scale that that hatch is, we can actually fix that. So I'm going to right click on one of the borings and select Edit. And then under the Format tab, I can change my hatch multiplier or my plot width, and that will actually modify the way that the hatch is showing up here. I'm actually pretty good with that. It looks like a pretty good scale in terms of presenting that information. But if I needed to change it, if it looked like maybe 1 or 2 lines across the whole section, I could change that that width, and that would fix that. Okay. But that's the basics of adding data either on the fly from this plot log or page log section, or just sort of from the start. But you'll notice that when I click on the Options tab of this strip log window, now the stratigraphy box is checked when initially it wasn't, and that's because I added it from that page log section. So what I want to do now is perhaps add some additional information, like maybe some well screen data. So if I click on the well screen and say OK again, it'll put that well screen and show me where that is in terms of the data that's present in EQuIS. Okay. So you might be wondering at this point where that screen data is coming from. So I promised we would come back to that Edit EQuIS Options section again, and this is one of those times that can be a handy piece of information to examine. So I'm going to move up to my Edit menu once more, and then select EQuIS Options. And under EQuIS Options and Sample Interval Horizon, you can see at this bottom section that my DT well segment type values is going to define what I'm calling my well screen interval. So if by default you aren't calling your well screen a screen, or maybe if you have multiple different kinds of screens that you might be referencing depending on the construction, you could add an additional. So if I want to be ridiculous and put end cap, I would just click on that and then click it over, and that would add it as a screen interval. So if I do that and then ask EnviroInsite to redraw, I would end up with 2 screens, one wherever the end cap is. Okay, I'm going to remove that because that's not good. You can also see that we've got the DT well segment well screen specified particularly for groundwater samples in this case, which is fine in terms of the Springfield data that I have set up here as well. Our well construction tab also allows us to define our backfill and well interval segments, which can be really handy as well. But I just wanted to point out that that's where you can set that and modify that as necessary based on the data set that you're using to plot. Okay. So I'll say okay. And I want to go back in and add some additional data to this set of strip logs. So again, I'll right click on my strip logs and select edit once more. And that's going to bring us back into our strip log options window. I want to add my depth to water in this case. So when I click depth to water, I should probably also check out my depth axis. So by default, it's set to select my elevation as my depth, but perhaps I want to switch it to depth instead. Can do that. Gives me a little snapshot of what my min and max values look like. And I'm going to ask it to use default limits. Everything else looks okay in this case. And so I'll say okay. And then over by the axis, we will see that show up. So here's our depth to water showing up in each of those strip logs. And you can see the slight variation with whatever the groundwater level is for each of those locations. Okay. So there are a few more things I want to add to these locations. I'll right click and select edit once more. And the one other thing I wanted to add in this case is my geophysics chart. So if you're keeping an eye on the page logs down here, you'll see that all but the geophysics has been checked on here. In general, I tend to prefer to set the geophysics information or the downhole point data from the strip log window because there's some additional configuration that's necessary. So I'm going to go ahead and check that box and then click on my geophysics selection. And it's blank, but don't panic. It's because I haven't actually defined what geophysics data I want to add, which is why checking that box over here in the page logs isn't necessarily going to present the information you want because there's a little bit more configuration that's necessary. So if I click add, it gives me the choices of geophysics or downhole point data that I want to add. So I'm going to select pore pressure and sleeve stress. And for each of those that I select, I just click the little right arrow to push it over into my selection section. Say okay. And it comes up with some default values for both of these types of data, but I'm going to ask it to set default. And to do that, it basically goes and looks at the data that's available in EQuIS and then changes that based on the available information. So I'll do the same thing on sleeve stress, say set default and say okay. So it takes a minute because it has to gather all of that information. And then there we have it plotted with our pore pressure and sleeve stress. Now I'm looking at this and it's not quite the pleasing color that I want it to be. So I'm actually going to go back into the options for the strip logs and change that for both pore pressure and sleeve stress. So I'll right click again and select edit. And the fill background is how I can adjust that color. It's a little bit too mustardy color for me. So for the pore pressure, maybe I want to make it this lovely lavender color. Okay. And then for sleeve stress, maybe I want to make it sort of a tan, pink, peach color. Okay. Once I click OK, it takes a second while it redraws, and then it will have applied those color changes that I just selected. Especially with having those be two separate colors, I think that helps be able to identify quickly which is which, particularly if only one of those is available. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom out to look at all of these so I can look at all of the data as it is in space. And you can see not all of the soil borings that I selected have all that downhole point data that I plotted using that geophysical selection. And that's okay. EnviroInsite is going to plot the data that's available in the associated EQuIS tables. Okay. So the last thing that I wanted to show you is back in the screen, or sorry, edit strip logs menu, and that is going to be our observation query. Now, this one might not be great with this particular data set. We're going to give it a shot, and if it's not going to show us what we want, I have a different location in my back pocket. But when you click on the observation query tab, it gives you a big list of basically all of the possible analytes you might report based on data that's available in DT result. However, you wouldn't necessarily have this associated data for each of those locations potentially, because you might not have sampled, for example, CIS1 to DCE at all of those locations. In this case, I'm going to just leave it at CIS1 to DCE. It is a groundwater sample. Total fraction is fine, although maybe I want to set that to N. And I'll go ahead and say, okay. And it'll think through it and go and query that data, and it's taking that average. I didn't show that setting, but it's essentially looking for that. And I don't see any numbers showing up here, and that's all right. I'll go ahead and select a totally different location, and we'll actually see what this looks like. So I'm going to right-click once more and select Edit. Oh, you know what? I forgot to check the observation box. That's the real trick there. Okay, so once I selected the observation query tab, I have to make sure that I've made that selection over here on the options as well. So let's give it one more shot. All right, no such luck anyhow. So I will right-click and select Edit once more. And this time I'm going to select my location query again, and I'm going to remove all of the soil borings that I had initially added. And this time I'm going to pick on B38 and say, okay. Just for fun, I'll leave all of the rest of this information checked, although I don't think that there's going to be any geophysics or downhole point data available to us from that particular location. So I'll go ahead and say, okay, and it's going to wipe away all of those other strip logs and then redraw based on my single selection. And you know what? I'll bet that it's not giving me the data because I changed my fraction from total to N. So I'll go back to my observation query and change that fraction back to total and say, okay. Aha. So I asked it to query based on the N fraction, and there wasn't any data based on that. So when I switched it to total, it gave me that. So because I selected CIS1 to DCE, it's giving me that result in, I think it's micrograms per liter. I can show you where we would check on that just to be certain. But there we have that information available to us for that particular CIS1 to DCE data. Okay. And as I suspected, we don't have any geophysical or downhole point data available for this particular location. All right, so I want to show you one last place which can show us the specifics of the observation. So if I right-click on the edit and then come back to my EQuIS options, if I click on the default units tab, you can see in this case that CIS1 to DCE for groundwater total data is reported in that unit of micrograms per liter. So that is that reference point there for me. Okay. So that brings us to the end of that demonstration. So I can go ahead and come back to my slides here. So what we talked about today is the strip logs and the available data that you can plot in it, including your stratigraphy, your boring data, observation and well screen information, depth to water or elevation, depending on how you want to plot that, and geophysics and downhole point data. So if you didn't get a chance to catch all of the sessions in this EnviroInsite series, we do have those videos available for you now. You can get those either on Screencast, the EarthSoft website, or YouTube. And those all will cover the topics of creating cross sections, the basemaps and layouts, the geochemistry plots, and once this has been edited and branded, this will be up there too. I think it's pretty straightforward. Like most EnviroInsite, it's pretty straightforward to get back into the settings and toggle that around. It's really pretty simple to create those strip logs. The real important bit is to make sure that you've got the associated EQuIS data behind it. So if you have any questions that occur to you after this session ends, or future topic suggestions, or if you'd like to sign up for a future office hour, you can email us at officehours@earthsoft.com. Thanks so much, everyone, for attending, and I hope you have a wonderful day.